Welcome. Today's the 18th day of Tammuz, the 24th of July, and we're on the fourth reading of Parshat Pinchas. And apart from hearing about how to make sure that the five daughters of Tzlofcha that we talked about yesterday receive their due, the second important, very important topic of this reading is one would call it the anointing of Joshua. So he's not anointed with oil or anything like that, but he's appointed, he's given the majesty that Moses had in order to succeed him. And I want us to read a little bit from it and ask in general the question of why does this even needed? One might say that it could be enough just that Moses would say that Joshua succeeds me. This whole thing that happens here and the whole discussion is not fully clear. So let's read it. We're looking at Numbers 27:15. Moses spoke to God, saying, "Let Havaya the God, the Spirit of all flesh, appoint a man over the congregation, who will go forth before them and come back before them, who will lead them out and bring them in. The congregation of God shall not be like a flock without a shepherd." And God said to Moses, "Convince Joshua the son of Nun, a man of spirit, to be this man. You must lay your hand upon him, and you must present him before Elazar the priest and before the entire congregation, and command him in their presence. You must bestow some of your majesty upon him, so that all the congregation of the Israelites will heed him. He will stand before Elazar the priest and seek him through judgment of the Urim before God. By word they will go out, and by word they will come back, and all Israel with him, and the entire assembly, the Sanhedrin." Moses did as God had commanded him. He convinced Joshua and presented him before Elazar the priest and before the entire congregation. He laid both hands upon him and commanded him in accordance with what God had spoken to Moses. So, this whole ceremony was meant to give from Moses' majesty. Now, what is that majesty exactly? That's the question. In Hebrew, the word is hod, which is the name of a sphera. It's the name of the fifth sphera of the motive sphirot, fifth sphera of the heart. It goes always together with netzach, with victory. And if I'd have to, we usually translate it, hod, as acknowledgement, to acknowledge. What exactly is it that Moses is giving him? Well, what is this ceremony? So, the Or HaChaim, Chaim ben Attar, he's who the Baal Shem Tov considered to be his, in a certain sense, his alter ego, the other half of his soul. And he said that if they would have been able to meet, they would have been able to bring the Messiah together. So he lived in the same period basically as the Baal Shem Tov, and he wrote a very important commentary on Torah. It's when you read it, you see that it's in many ways it's the first modern commentary on the Torah. And he's very Kabbalistic, very deep, but he's also living already in what seems like to be the beginning of modernity. Even though he was from Morocco, he went through Italy, through Livorno, before he came to the land of Israel, and he only was able to live here for a year, first in Akko and then in Jerusalem, and he passed away at the age of 47. His day of passing was was Sunday this week, the 15th of Tammuz. So he writes in his commentary that in practice it's pretty impossible to have a leader that fits the bill that Moses was and that would fit the bill of what Moses is requesting from God, because he says, how can 600,000 people agree with what one person is doing and vice versa? How can Moses agree with 600,000 opinions? That's almost, it's impossible. He says the only way that this can be is if as we know, Moses is an all-inclusive soul. In the way that this is seen, it's explained in the Tanya in the second chapter, but there was a lot of theory, political theory that was written around this, because we see that this is how the Torah describes Moses, and there's a verse in Isaiah 63 that literally says that Moses is his people are Moses, and it's meant here much more than just the fact that they nullified to him, that they accept his leadership. It means that they agreed with him. So that's why it's called majesty, or as we said, it's hod, it's acknowledgement. They acknowledge that what Moses is doing is what they wanted to do, it's according to their will, and Moses acknowledges their will and says, yes, that's what I want to do anyway. So how can something like this be? So the answer is that this has to be a very special soul, a soul that in a sense begets the entire generation, that all the people of the generation are in a certain sense a branch of this soul in some way. So that's very hard to find, and that's what Moses is saying to God. I want someone to replace me who will be like me, who will have that same quality. But how can that be? Because, well, first of all, it explains why Moses couldn't enter the land of Israel with this new generation that was born in the wilderness, because even though he had taught them from their teen years, because everybody over the age of 20 had passed away already, so these were all young people who had matured with Moses. Still, they're different. Even though they come from him, he doesn't understand them fully, and that was the whole predicament of Moses striking the rock, the boulder, and until water came out, and calling them mutineers, like rebellious. They didn't speak the same language. But who does speak their language? It's Joshua. Joshua can speak the language. And so says the Or HaChaim, that the way we have to understand this is that the generation that came out of Egypt was like Moses. They were men of the intellect, the men of the sphera of Da'at. They're called a Dor De'ah, they're called a generation of Da'at, the generation of knowledge. And whether this came as a result of being in Egypt, whether this came as a result of receiving the Torah, whatever it was, the 40 years that they spent in the wilderness with the Torah and with no mundane needs, no mundane worries, transformed them maybe into men of intellect. But the generation that grew up after them was completely different. And this generation that needed to go into the land of Israel and to conquer it, and back then it was the land of Canaan because there were 7 Canaanite nations. I think we've talked about in the past how these 7 Canaanite nations correspond to the 7 emotive faculties of the heart, from loving kindness all the way down to kingdom. And so where Moses was the man of intellect, the leader of all the intellect in that generation, Joshua was the leader of all the emotions. And the way that you see that Joshua is an emotive man is, if you remember a couple in Parshat Ba'aloscha, when there was another episode with Moses giving 70 elders from his spirit. So there were 2 that were left out, Eldad and Medad, and they continued to prophesize. And their prophecy was that Moses will not bring us into the land. Remember, this was before, this is 38 years ago. Moses will not enter with us into the land, rather it will be Joshua. And what did Joshua say to Moses? Kill them. Because how can they give such a prophecy? He was very emotional about it. And Moses was very calm and intellectual about it. And he said, leave them be. Would it be that all the people of God would be prophets? Not just these 2. So what says the Or HaChaim is that from one generation to the next, there's always a lessening of the intellect. Meaning, relative to our previous generation, the people that taught us, we're emotional. They were intellectual. And so there needs to be someone who receives the intellect. The intellect needs to carry on from generation to generation. That's the premise of Torah. The intellect stays the same. And so that's what God is telling Moses here to do. He's telling him, put your hand over him and give him from your majesty, which means give him from your intellect. So that Joshua is not only accepted because he's on the same wavelength as everybody emotionally. And when you think about it, to conquer a land, you need to have a lot of emotion. And if Joshua here is going to be the leader, the general, before the camp, he's got to be inclusive, all-inclusive of all the emotions in that generation. But if he's like that, so where's his intellect? So as much as he was always with Moses, this is a general statement about the relationship between a student and a teacher, that as smart as the student is always emotional regarding what the teacher teaches. He always feels an affinity that is more akin to love than to understanding. And that leads to a certain type of relationship, and we've talked about this, the relationship between a teacher and a student, which is considered to be the most complex and highest of all the relationships, even more than the relationship between a husband and a wife. And the student feels love towards the teacher. But the teacher has to make sure, like in this case, Moses has to make sure that he's giving from his majesty, meaning giving from his intellect, so that the Torah remains constant from one generation to the next. And so that's why this is called give from your majesty, your hod. Your hod is your acknowledgement. You need to acknowledge Joshua, and Joshua needs to acknowledge you. So if we have here the all-inclusive soul of the teacher, Moses, he's an all-inclusive soul, and Joshua is the all-inclusive heart. He's the emotions. So there also has to be an all-inclusive nefesh, psyche. And who is the all-inclusive psyche here? There is no one who's that, but it's the entire people. The entire people represent the psyche of this all-inclusive soul. So the all-inclusive soul is made out of the intellect of the previous generation, the emotion of the current generation, and the people of the current generation. And the Lubavitcher Rebbe mentioned this many times, that these three things have to go together for there to be a complete generation. And he used to use the acronym miyad, which means immediately. He used to say the Mashiach should come immediately, techef umiyad mamash, immediately, right now. And so this word miyad, he used to say, is an acronym for Moses, Joshua, their generation. That Moses is the all-inclusive soul of the generation, the intellect of the generation. Soul is always the intellect. The soul is considered to be in the mind, in the intellect. The spirit of the entire generation, which is Joshua, and the generation itself, which is like the nefesh, this psyche, the third, the lowest part, the active, habitual part of the generation. So these three things need to go together. Now this is related to the relationship between the Orach Chaim and the Baal Shem Tov. There was one time in the third meal of Shabbat that when he went to wash his hands, the Baal Shem Tov said, the Orach Chaim just passed away. This man, Chaim ben Atar, the holy Orach Chaim, who we just said was from Morocco and went through Livorno to the land of Israel and passed away when he was 47, and the Baal Shem Tov held very highly of him. He passed away. And how did he know? He said, because there's only one person who knows the secret of washing the hands before a meal in every generation. The secret is only revealed to one person. We've talked about this in the past. And I was just revealed the secret. It says, if I was just given the secret, it means that the Orach Chaim, who was the possessor of the secret before me, passed away. Because there's only one person in the generation that knows the secret. What is the secret? We've talked about this in the past. It's a secret of when you finish washing your hands, you raise your hands up to this level, to the level of the brain. And you say, Su'idachem kodesh u'valchu et Hashem. You don't say it because you can't say it, but you think it. Su'idachem kodesh u'valchu et Hashem. Raise your hands to the holy means to wisdom, and bless God is to bring down what you took from there. So it's called the secret of washing hands, because after you've washed your hands, they're the ones that bring the intellect down into the heart, because the hands come out of the heart. So you raise the hands, you lift them up to take the intellect down. So this is the secret of what Moses here did. God told him to place one hand on Joshua, which would mean to put half of his intellect, some of his majesty, some of his hod, some of his acknowledgement, but Moses put both hands on him. We say from here we learn that Moses was a lover of his student. Just as much as Joshua loved him, he loved him just as much, and he gave him twice as much as what God had commanded him to give. And so Joshua became, in a sense, the continuation here of the intellect, the Torah of Moses, not just the emotional aspects that he had received as a student. So we have some very beautiful principles here about the relationship between a student and a teacher, but also, not less important, is the relationship between both of them and the people. That the only person who can really be a leader of the Jewish people is someone who, either intellectually or emotionally, is all-inclusive. That everybody feels that they're represented by him. So with this we'll end today. Hope to see you tomorrow. All the best.